Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Susan. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Thank you. I want to talk today. I'm just going to move this out of the way because I know I will trip on it if I don't. I want to talk today about Hugh Mercer, right? But specifically in the context of the French and Indian War. So I'm going to spend some time talking about his experience in the French and Indian War, which is, of course, where he met George Washington that ultimately brought him to Fredericksburg. But I actually want to start by kind of stepping back a little bit and talking about the broader colonial world of the 1740s and the 1750s. What's sort of going on in Virginia, right, where Washington is, in Pennsylvania, where Mercer first settles, right, and particularly when those different provincial worlds are coming into conflict and contact and conflict with each other in the Ohio country, right, in the Ohio River Valley, what's now Western Pennsylvania. And I want to talk a little bit about the sort of the 1740s into the 1750s, right? The actual war itself, how Mercer and Washington meet there. Of course, ending with Mercer moving to Fredericksburg in 1760 at the end of the war on the advice of his friend George. I want to put that in some bigger context too about what are some of the bigger political and cultural shifts that are going on within the British Empire in North America in these years, right? And the sort of overarching story I want to tell over the course of the next half hour or so, right, is how the British colonial world in North America goes from one that is really quite atomized and separate, and in many cases kind of conflictual, right, to having British colonists beginning to have more of what I might call an imperial continental imagination, right? Understanding themselves as part of a broader British imperial project, right? And I want to end by sort of reflecting on that friendship between Washington and Mercer as kind of embodying those new kinds of imperial relations within the colony of North America, which is going to set the stage then, a decade and a half later, right, for colonists with this newly imperial sense of themselves to begin to pick a big bone with the actual empire itself, right? So we're sort of setting the stage for what happens decade and a half after my talk ends today. Let's start with sort of the middle colonies in the middle decades of the 18th century. The point I want to start out with, right, is that when we're talking about the West, right? And the West in this period means sort of west of the Blue Ridge, right? What we call the Trans-Appalachian West. That the actual colonial claims in that region are a total mess, right? And that is because, right, when individual colonies were being chartered by the crown, right, beginning in 1607, and then moving forward into the 1680 in this part of the world, right, they don't really know very much about what's west of the Appalachians, and B, they aren't paying very close attention to how those lines might cross or intersect or overlap, right? So if you look at this, right, the original 1609 Virginia charter there, you can see those lines, is like incredibly extensive, right? It gets chipped away with the formation of the Carolinas, right? Pennsylvania, New Jersey, parts of New York, Maryland get chipped out of that, right? But Virginia still has pretty extensive claims to the Trans-Appalachian West, right? Into the 1780s, Virginia is laying claim to basically pretty much all of the modern Midwest, right, on the basis of this. Massachusetts and Connecticut, when they are chartered, right, they draw a northern and a southern boundary for both of them, but they don't really draw a western boundary. So both Connecticut and Massachusetts claim these strips that go west as far as the Mississippi. And this map, because it's focused on Virginia, doesn't even capture the full messiness of that whole situation, where Connecticut basically claims the entire northern third of Pennsylvania. They actually go to war in the 1780s in the Wyoming Valley. Pennsylvania and Connecticut do. The Wyoming Valley, what's now Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, over those claims, right? They actually fight a little mini war over that.
I never knew that.
Massachusetts claims the entire western half of New York State right now. So that's not even on this map too, right? And then, of course, Pennsylvania, right, which is sort of described in its charter as being, west of the Delaware River, right? They, of course, famously get into a fight with Maryland about where the line is, leading to Mason's and Dixon's line, right? It's unclear where Pennsylvania ends in the West, too, right? And the area that we're going to be focusing on today, right, is this area right here, right, where Virginia, specifically Virginia and Pennsylvania's claims overlap, too. You also see this claimed by New York. We're going to get to that. We can get to that later. That's really much more in the late 1760s, where New York colonial officials, by dint of their relationship with the Iroquois through what is called the Covenant Chain, are extending New York's provincial claims over all territory that the Iroquois themselves claim, right, which is also much of the modern Midwest and Kentucky. Though, and we'll get to this in a minute, the Indians who actually live there really do not think that this is part of Iroquois, right? So, there's New York is trying to be like, well, this is kind of part of New York because the Iroquois claim it and we have a relationship with the Iroquois, right? So it's a total mess out there, right? So that's the first piece of context, right? This messiness doesn't matter a whole lot before the 1740s because there just aren't that many sort of Anglo-descended people, right? European-descended people in this part of the world, right? There's just not. The overlap is theoretical. It's not actually a problem in the 1740s. But a couple of things begin to change in the 1740s that begin to send Anglo-American colonists west of the mountains in ways that make these conflicting claims begin to become a problem, right? The first one I want to point to is the fur trade. Now, New York has had made quite an extensive profit on colonial fur trade through their relationships with the Iroquois, who are generally trading furs with indigenous groups that live further west and further north, coming into conflict with the French, which we'll get to in a moment on that subject. By the 1740s, merchants, at that point, Philadelphia is about 60 years old, right? The merchants of Philadelphia want to get in on some of this lucrative fur trade. So they're beginning to expand trading networks out into the upper Ohio Valley here, in the area around what's now Pittsburgh, right? And sort of west on the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio borderland area, right? Where there are indigenous groups that they can build commercial relationships with to trade for fur. So this is merchants in Philadelphia trying to get a piece of that trade that has been making New York wealthy for a century at this point. So we're beginning to see representatives of the sort of Pennsylvania colonial authority, right? People operating under Pennsylvania's colonial authority out in this part of the world trading furs. And this is an image from actually a French map in the 1770s. This is a cartouche, the little decoration at the corner of the map, giving a contemporary representation of what that trade might have looked like. When we get to the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland, there are some broad economic and demographic shifts beginning to happen in the 1740s that, as we're going to see, are going to begin to push people west of the mountains, right? The first one I want to talk about here is the stagnation of the tobacco economy in the Chesapeake. As you can see, in the 17th century, tobacco cultivation is growing at approximately the same pace, even slightly faster than population, right? Tobacco cultivation is intensifying, which means from the perspective of white Virginians, if you want to make your fortune, right, in the 17th century, the solution is grow more tobacco, right? But you can see in the 18th century, and then especially beginning around 1740, that these two lines really diverge. That, tobacco cultivation is growing sort of in a linear way, but population is beginning to grow in an exponential way, which means that there is less and less wealth to be generated from tobacco cultivation in the Chesapeake in the 18th century. Quick question, sir. Yeah.
You've got the population in the index. What was the actual population?
A few 100,000 people. Okay. Right, yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to get to that the next slide. We're going to talk about that next slide, yeah. Okay, so from the perspective of white Virginians, right, the tobacco economy is kind of chugging along fine, but it's not providing a lot of opportunity for an upcoming generation. No new fortunes really are being made. And there's a lot of complicated reasons for this decline. It has to do with soil exhaustion, has to do with market saturation, right? There's only so much tobacco that Europeans are going to consume, right? So they're beginning to bump up against the limits of demand in some ways, right? There's a lot of complicated reasons for why this is happening. But then I want to take this point about population, and to your point, sir, right? And look at actually what population growth looks like across the colonies, right? So we got 1740, right? Virginia is just shy of 200,000 people, right? Right? But the thing I want to point out, these are, all the colonies, starting from 1620. And what I want to point out is that, first of all, Virginia, right, that population growth, Virginia is by far the most populous of the colonies, and it's also the place where the population is growing the most rapidly, right? So this population explosion that's happening in the middle decades of the 18th century, Virginia is really ground zero. The other colony that we're talking about at play here is Pennsylvania, which is the gray line right here. Pennsylvania, remember, gets a later start, right? It's not really being settled meaningfully until the early 1680s by the British. So they're getting a later start, but look at, they're the kind of Johnny-come-lately that's rocketing ahead. By 1760, they're ahead of Maryland, right, in third place. And if this chart extended to 1770, they would have passed Massachusetts by 1770. So Pennsylvania is a place, it's less populous than Virginia because it's kind of starting later, but it is catching up quickly, right? So this population explosion that's happening in the middle decades of the 18th century, really Virginia and Pennsylvania are the kind of standout colonies where that's happening. And of course, what do Pennsylvania and Virginia have in common, right? If people are looking for places to expand, right? If they're looking for new kinds of economic opportunities, right? The place they have to look is west, right? And of course, because of these conflicting land claims, right, it's unclear who's in charge, right? Is that Pennsylvania? Is that Virginia? Both colonies think that it's part of them, right? And they're newly interested in this question in the middle decades of the 18th century. So this leads to what I described in my title as the scramble for the Ohio country, which is really heating up in the second half of the 1740s.
Can I ask you a real quick question?
Sure.
I'm sorry, on that slide, you said Kent Island was claimed until
1776, yeah.
by
Virginia.
Virginia.
Yes, this is going back to the founding of Maryland, right? Actually, there are a million of these kind of petty territorial claims. Really, they don't get resolved until the moment of the Articles of Confederation,
okay,
right? Where basically, if you want to sign on to the Articles of Confederation, you have to kind of sort out those land claims. And even then, it doesn't really happen until sometimes the 1780s, right? So it takes a while for all the colonies now becoming states to agree what their hard western boundaries are, and that whatever lies west of that is part of the United States, but is not part of one of the colonies, right? And that's where you begin to create the legal status of a federal territory, right? And then with the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, right, you begin to get the legal framework for taking that federal territory and moving it into new states. That's an important point. About the early 1780s, that was not at all clear that that's how the growth of the United States would come, right? Because these different colonies turning into states have these incredibly extensive westward claims based on their original charters, right? So this is all very up in the air in the middle decades of the 18th century. What's the legal framework under which westward settlement's gonna happen, right? Okay, so this is the Ohio country, right? Let's talk a little bit about who are the participants in this scramble for the Ohio country. We should start with who actually lives there, right? Which is mostly Native Americans, right? And the Ohio country north of the Ohio River there are basically sort of 5 big, powerful groups, as well as a lot of smaller groups, as well as some groups that don't live in the area who lay claim to that, right? So there's the Mingos, who are Iroquois, who have moved west, right? There's the Delawares, right, who are Algonquin speakers who've moved west from kind of the more settled parts of Pennsylvania. You got the Shawnees, you got the Wyandots up here around sort of Sandusky and Toledo, and then the Miamis, which are out more sort of in Indiana, right, what's now the modern state of Indiana, right? So you've got a whole bunch of, and these 5 groups in particular are quite large and quite powerful, right? They wield a lot of power on the ground there. Then you've got the Cherokee, right, who live down here on what's now sort of North Carolina, North Georgia, right, eastern Tennessee. They lay claim quite strong claim, at least to the southern bank of the Ohio River, right? Because what is now Kentucky had been historically kind of Cherokee-controlled hunting territory for a long time, right? The Iroquois, I said as a moment ago, and this is for reasons that date back to what are called the Beaver Wars of the 17th century, right? The Iroquois had inflicted military defeat on a number of these groups in the previous century, and on the basis of that, claimed authority over them too, right? So the Iroquois, who are of course up in upstate New York, right, and the Cherokee, who are down in the southern Appalachians, also are exerting territorial claims here, even though they don't really live there, right? So it's a very complicated mess of people who actually live there on the ground. Of course, then there's the French, right? The French have laid claim to the Ohio Valley since about 1680, right? When LaSalle is the explorer who's coming out of Canada and first gets to the upper Mississippi, and he basically lays claim to the Mississippi and all of its tributaries on behalf of France. So the France claims to have a pre-existing claim to the Ohio Valley on the basis of that, of LaSalle's claims. And they are there on the ground in a smaller way already, right? Now the French manner of interacting with the West and with indigenous people didn't involve a lot of French people, right? A handful of soldiers, larger numbers of fur traders, small number of Jesuits, right? Who tended to live with and among and often tightly intermarried and intersettled with different indigenous groups. And they use those relationships, right, to build these profitable trade networks that, in this case, right, were really designed to funnel furs north up to Lake Erie and then out through the St. Lawrence and out through the markets in Montreal and Quebec. Secondarily, down the Ohio to the Mississippi and out through New Orleans, which of course was also an important French trading post at this time. Right? So there are French folks on the ground. By the mid-1740s, the French begin to figure out that the English colonists, right, the British colonists, have aggressive designs on this area. So they begin to assert more concrete claims. Right? In 1749, a Frenchman named Pierre-Joseph Celeron de Blainville traveled down the upper Ohio Valley burying lead plates, which was a kind of French ritual of sort of claiming the territory, right? By the early 1750s, they're building a series of forts, and particularly forts that connect the main French route in and out of the Ohio Valley, which starts up here in Mingo country at what's now Erie, Pennsylvania, where they have Fort Presque Isle on Lake Erie. And then following down the Allegheny River, right, and there's a couple of other forts there. There's one called Fort Le Boeuf, one called Fort Venango, and then the fort that's closest to the frontiers of British expansion, which is called Fort Duquesne. Anybody know where Fort Duquesne was? Anyone would guess? It's right, what's now downtown Pittsburgh, right, on the point. So it's where the Allegheny and the Monongahela come together to form the Ohio. So it's a really important strategic point for the control of the Ohio territory. So the French in the early 1750s are building a line of forts to protect their main access into the Ohio country. All right, so what does British involvement look like, right? Well, it's largely taking the form of what's called land speculation, right? Which is there are wealthy people, and we're going to talk about this in slightly different ways in both Virginia and in Pennsylvania, who are looking for ways to assert ownership claims over large chunks of territory in the Ohio Valley, which they intend to kind of sit on until settlement gets there, and then they can take these large tracts and carve them up into smaller freehold farms and sell them at quite a handsome profit to settlers when they get there, right? So both, by the late 1740s, both Virginians and Pennsylvanians are trying to get in on this game in slightly different ways. The kind of characteristically Virginia way of going about this is to organize a large joint company that can command a lot of capital, right? And the Virginians tend to start with the crown. They go to the crown first and try to get permission from the crown and to get land patents from the crown. So the most famous example is called the Ohio Company. It's formed in 1748, organized by Thomas Lee, who's the president of the Virginia Council of State. Within his partners, his organizing partners are Lawrence and Augustus Washington, in case you wonder how George got involved, right? But if you look at the list of investors of the Ohio Company, it's like a total who's who, right, of the Virginia elite, right? It's Robert Dinwiddie, who's the lieutenant governor, which in Virginia usually means the person who's in charge, because the actual governor is not usually there. He's back in England. George Washington, George Mason, right? The Mercer family, not Hugh Mercer family, right? The Lee family, right? Robert Carter of Nominee Hall, right? The Talos of Mount Airy, right? It's like a who's who, right? Are investors in this Ohio Company. And so this is how Virginians tend to do. They band together, they raise a lot of capital from rich people, they try to get the blessing of the crown, right? And that they use that as the legal basis for their claim. And it works. In 1749, the British Crown grants the company 500,000 acres, mostly sort of on the south bank downstream from modern Pittsburgh, right? Now remember, these are lines on a map, right? These are just lines on a map. The Virginians tend to send out surveyors, right? That's their agents in the backcountry. And of course, this is what we know about George Washington famously in his youth, that he was a surveyor. Like, well, yeah, he's an agent for a land company, let's be clear, right? He was an agent for a land company. There's another one called the Loyal Company of Virginia that gets organized in 1749. Probably the most famous person you heard of involved in that is Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father. So this is a sort of competitor. They don't really succeed. They are unable to get a patent from the crown. So the Loyal Company of Virginia, spends a lot of the 1750s trying to get their hands on one of these big royal patents, and they don't actually succeed, right? But this is it's a similar model. The Pennsylvanians operate differently. They operate sort of more like the French did, and their land speculation claims come out of their history of fur trade, right? So the idea is they build relationships with indigenous people through trade, right? Through intermarriage. Right? They use gift diplomacy, right, which is the sort of traditional way of building diplomatic relationships with indigenous people. And they try to transfer that into essentially land sales from indigenous people. And the theory there is if they can get claim to the land from the Indians, right, and they can get settlers onto the land, the crown will retroactively have to represent that as a kind of fait accompli, right? They're there, they're living on the land, they're farming it, right? And that claim will supersede a theoretical limited legal claim coming out of Virginia, right, that doesn't actually have any people actuating it, right? The most famous example from Pennsylvania is a guy named George Croghan, who's an Irish-born fur trader. He's active in this area by the 1730s, right? He speaks a bunch of native languages. He's married to a bunch of native women, at least sort of ceremonially, right? He's sort of integrated into indigenous kin networks, and he's constantly shuttling back and forth between the Ohio Valley and Philadelphia, facilitating trade, facilitating diplomacy, and ultimately, right, acquiring hundreds of thousands of acres of land through sale, particularly from the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Miamis, right? So these groups that are actually living sort of on the north bank of the Ohio River, right?
He's French? Or, I mean, I know he came from Ireland, but
he represents the interests of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
You can think of him as sort of a Pennsylvanian, right? In this period, right? So you can see, bit of a mess here, right? We've got actual Indians on the ground, most of whom don't want to have anything to do with this at all, right? You've got French people who have long-standing relationship with these indigenous groups, right? But there's not a lot of French people on the ground, right? Their claims are really on the basis of the strengths of those relationships they have with indigenous people, right? But they're also moving kind of aggressively in the early 1750s to try to lock this territory down, right? And then you've got two different groups of British colonists, right, who are fighting each other, right, with very different models of land speculation and very different sets of legal claims about who owns this territory, right? One coming out of Virginia, one coming out of Pennsylvania. Into this, right, we drop Hugh Mercer, right? So Hugh Mercer, born in Scotland in 1726, right, 100 years ago, like next week, right, or something, right? He's trained as a physician as a teenager. He gets caught up in the Jacobite Wars, right? And ends up having to leave Scotland in 1746. Right? So he's like 20 years old, right? He ends up in Pennsylvania, right? And he moves to just outside of the town of Greencastle, Pennsylvania, which is sort of south of Chambersburg, just north of the Maryland border. If you're driving up 81, right, from Maryland into Pennsylvania, it's basically it's the first thing you hit on 81 when you cross into Pennsylvania. He settles just west of it, sort of in this part of Pennsylvania right here. So right at the foothills of the Blue Ridge. And what is really, still very much the frontiers of settlement in Pennsylvania in the 1740s, right? This is a frontier settlement. The Pennsylvanians are operating sort of fur trade and beginning to operate land speculation further west, right? But this is really the frontier of what actual sort of agricultural settlement is in Pennsylvania in this period. So that's where Hugh Mercer ends up in the late 1740s. So he is positioned to be in the thick of it, right, when things begin to go south in the early 1750s, which is what I want to get to now, right? What happens in the early 1750s? Really, this is one thing I always tell my students about the French and Indian War, is that it is compared to most imperial wars of the 17th and the 18th century, it's a very tail wags the dog war. Right? The colonists get the empires into the war rather than the other way around. The French and the British fight plenty of times in North America across the late 17th and early 18th century, but that's almost always the empires get to war and the colonists get dragged in as a result. French and Indian War is very much the opposite. Right? The colonists pick the fight and drag the empires into war behind them. And really, the instigating figures here are Dinwiddie and George Washington, right? Representatives of the Ohio Company. So by 1753, right, they're looking to make good on this patent they've gotten from the crown, right? And their calculation is that the French are the biggest threat to them being able to make good on that land patent. So they get very interested in Dinwiddie, remember the lieutenant governor, Washington, who's a sort of working as this agent of the Ohio Company, right? Interrelated with all these families that are the big investors, and Dinwiddie himself also being a big investor, right? They want to push push the French out of the upper Ohio Valley, right? And their theory, which is a little bit racist, right, is that the Indians will fall into line if the French are gone. They think the problem is the French, not the Indians. If you get the French out of there, the Indians will fall into line. That's a total misunderstanding of the situation. The Indians, in fact, do not want them there, right? And the Indians are using the French as a bulwark to keep the British out, right? So they've completely misunderstood, but at any rate, that's their calculus, is get the French out of there, right? And the Indians will sort of fall into line and we can begin to settle people on our land and make money, right? So in 1753, Washington, in October 1753, Dinwiddie sends Washington to meet with the French and tell them to withdraw. And he meets with the French commander Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre at Fort Le Boeuf, which is, it's probably off this map, but it's up on the Allegheny River here between sort of what's now Pittsburgh and Erie, Pennsylvania. Tells him to withdraw from the Ohio Company, and Legardeur de Saint-Pierre sort of like laughs at him. It's like, ha ha ha, no, right? Washington comes back, right? By March, and that incident accelerates the French fort building, and particularly at Fort Duquesne, which is the frontier, right? That's the one that is the forward-most fort of these French forts, the one closest to where the British are sniffing around, right? So the French, kind of in the winter of 1753, 1754, are really building up and fortifying Fort Duquesne. In early 1754, Dinwiddie sends Washington up there again to try to disrupt this fort strengthening, right? And in May, Washington basically follows what's labeled here as Braddock's Road, right? Out through Winchester, across now sort of the northern part of West Virginia, and headed north towards Fort Duquesne up here, right? In May of 1754, engages in a little skirmish called the Battle of Jumonville Glen, right? It's just a little skirmish, right? But the French and the Indians and their allied military forces surround Washington and his contingent of Virginians at what Washington he's got a sense of humor, calls Fort Necessity, because he like puts up a bunch of logs and calls it Fort Necessity. In July of 1754, and surrounds them, and Washington has to surrender, right? And essentially, the sort of French, like in a sort of act of honor, say, okay, as long as you pick up your troops and leave, go home, right, without causing a fight, we'll let you go. So they let Washington go, and he goes back to Virginia. Virginians not that good at militarily displacing the French and the Indians from the Ohio Valley, but what they are good at is working the halls of power back in London. So Dinwiddie and his allies back in London are able to convince Newcastle, who's the prime minister at the time, that the French in the Ohio Valley is an existential threat to the British Empire. Is it? No. It's an existential threat to the interests of the Ohio Company. Absolutely, right? But it's not an existential threat to the British Empire. But anyway, he convinces Newcastle. Newcastle orders a British Army unit under General Edward Braddock over to Virginia and tells them to go and drive the French out of the Ohio River Valley, right? To do what Washington and the Virginia provincials could not do. This is actually, in the moment, seems small, but in retrospect, this is the first time that there's an army of British regulars on the ground in North America, right? This is 1754, right? We're 150 years into British colonial history in North America. This is the first time that there is a contingent of British Army regulars on the ground. But the Virginians are glad, right? They're like, okay, we're gonna go up there, we're gonna have a real army now, get the French out of there, and we will be able to lay our claims to the Ohio Valley, right? And secondarily, outfox the Pennsylvanians, right? Because we've got the crown and we've got the army with us, right? Reinforcing our claims. Braddock, right, famously in 1755 marches west, right, and encounters again the French and the Indians, their allied forces at the Battle of the Monongahela, which is again a military disaster for the British, right? I should say, right, both Mercer and Washington are there, right? So Braddock has his column of British regulars, but they're being supported by provincial troops from both Virginia and from Pennsylvania. So Washington is there. We don't think they met each other at that point, right? Both of them are there fighting this battle. Mercer himself, right, who had mustered into the Pennsylvania provincial forces in 1754, right? After Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity, right? The sort of the Pennsylvania frontier settlements begin to organize sort of local forces to protect against French or Indian assaults from across the mountains. So Mercer is mustered in 1754 into the Pennsylvania provincial forces, and he's there too. He actually gets injured, right? He's wounded in the arm at the Battle of the Monongahela. Not fatally, not badly, but he is injured there. Braddock gets killed, right? Braddock gets killed. Huge British rout, right? Both the redcoats and the provincial forces retreat back east again with their tail between their legs. And that really sort of sets the pattern for the next couple of years, right? Which is that the French and the Indians, this alliance that dates back to the earliest years of the 17th century, right, is strong, it's powerful, right? And it is able to not only keep the British out of the Ohio Valley, but is actually able to push back very aggressively. And so what you see then in 1756 and 1757, right, is that both Mercer and Washington, right, and the provincial forces that they are associated with spend those years occupying and trying to strengthen the frontier, right? And the frontier of both Virginia and Pennsylvania gets pushed back, right? People flee those westernmost settlements in these years, scared of the French and Indians. So, the Shenandoah Valley is emptying out in 1756 and 1757, right? The settlement of Pennsylvania in these sort of the valleys around the Juniata, right? And that sort of part, right? Absolutely emptying out. Washington spends most of his time at Fort Loudon, right, kind of organizing defenses there, which is what's now Winchester. Mercer, right, is put in charge of Fort Shirley up here in Pennsylvania, which is, again, another one of these kind of just real rough kind of frontier forts designed to push back against the French and Indians who are pushing aggressively at the frontiers of settlement in these years. They're really triumphant. Mercer participated in September of 1756 in what's called the Kittening Expedition, which is a group of Pennsylvania provincial forces that march out of Fort Shirley and Fort Littleton, headed for this village of Kittening on the Allegheny River. It's hundreds of miles away. I don't know how to wake that back up again. But it's an Indian village, right? And they launch a surprise attack on it. Mercer actually gets injured in the attack on Kittening, injured and separated from his unit, right? Ends up walking he claims hundreds of miles wounded through the wilderness, gets picked up by a bunch of what he describes as Cherokees loyal to the crown, right? Who kind of take him, nurse him back to health. He helps nurse some other injured people back to health. And they end up letting him go, right? So Mercer has a whole crazy adventure here in this this middle period here as part of this Kittening expedition. Bunch of stuff happens, mostly up in Canada, right? In the intervening years, we don't have to get into it too much. But by 1758, right, the British are sufficiently reorganized and resupplied and re-energized that they're ready to go on the offense again in the Ohio River Valley. And it's in the summer of 1758, it was called the Forbes Expedition, which leaves from Pennsylvania, from sort of the western parts of Pennsylvania, right, and moves very slowly and deliberately up across the mountains, right, has a couple of battles in the fall. In October, there's a battle here at Fort Ligonier, and ultimately makes it and defeats Fort Duquesne that in the fall of 1758. Now again, both Washington and Mercer are on this, but they know each other by this point. They had met sometime, we think, in 1757, right, where Mercer, this is after his adventures on the Kittening expedition, he ends up in Shippensburg, right? There's a fort called Fort Morris, right, in Shippensburg that he's in charge of. And Washington, who is, again, mostly operating out of Fort Loudon at this point, he's traveling up and down this sort of like this, the front lines here, you know, coordinating, organizing cooperation. And it's this point where Mercer and Washington meet each other and become friends at Fort Morris at Shippensburg. And Washington is, you know, trying to coordinate these frontier defenses up and down the frontier of the Blue Ridge here. Anyway, so both Washington and Mercer go on the Forbes expedition, which actually defeats Fort Duquesne. The French and the Indians abandon Fort Duquesne. They destroy it on their way out. And so Mercer spends 1758 and most of 1759 at Fort Duquesne, leading the process of rebuilding it. Even in retrospect, it's unclear how much this is true in the moment, but in retrospect, people call this sort of temporary fort Fort Mercer in his honor. We don't have a lot of contemporary references to that. That's maybe something that, like, sort of people remember later once Mercer becomes more of a hero, right? But he's definitely there, right? And he's definitely very important in helping rebuild Fort Duquesne, which they rename Fort Pitt, after William Pitt, who is the prime minister who takes over after Newcastle. And Pitt is the great champion in Parliament of American colonial interests here, right? So they name Fort Pitt in his honor. It's probably here, right, that Washington says to Mercer, okay, you know, when you're done, why don't you come down to Fredericksburg? You know, you're a doctor, right? You have an apothecary, right? You could make a really good living for yourself in this town called Fredericksburg. And so sometime at the end of 1759, right, he makes that decision, and by 1760, he's mustered out. You know, the French and Indian War really goes on. You know, the Treaty of Paris that ends it isn't until 1763. But the fighting is functionally done, at least insofar as we consider the Ohio Valley, by 1760, right? But with the fall of Fort Duquesne, the fighting is functionally over in this part of the war. So Mercer musters out, and he comes back here, right, at the invitation of his friend. And I want to leave that part of the story here, right? Because in a couple of weeks, you guys are going to have other speakers who are going to talk more specifically about Mercer's years in Fredericksburg after 1760. But I just want to talk a little bit about what this part of the world looks like after 1760, and then some takeaways, right? About I think how we can understand Hugh Mercer and George Washington in the context of this larger history, right? What are some conclusions we can draw about it, right? The war, in a lot of important ways, puts a lid on these fighting, on this dispute between Virginia and Pennsylvania over this part of the world, right? I mean, I think an important thing that the war does, particularly during the war years itself, right, is it brings the British colonists together by virtue of a common enemy, i.e. the French and the Indians, right? And this is a sort of famous thing that the British don't call this the French and Indian War. They call it the 7 Years' War. But the colonists call it the French and Indian War because that's the enemy. It's the French and the Indians, right? And so, and I think that it's really interesting that the war itself not only is moving people all around the landscape and therefore causing Pennsylvanians like Hugh Mercer and Virginians like George Washington to meet each other. But I think the very particular political conditions of the war open up that space for Virginians and Pennsylvanians to see themselves as people who are on the same side when it comes to the Ohio Valley, right? This is really about asserting British imperial claims to this part of the world at the expense of the French, right? And that sort of question of like, is this Pennsylvania? Is this Virginia, right? Do Croghan's land patents control? Or to the Ohio Company, right? That all gets kind of papered over by the war itself. After 1763, it comes roaring right back again, right? I should say, right? In ways that don't particularly involve Washington and Mercer, because they've sort of moved on with their lives at that point, right? But the Crown famously draws what it called the Royal Proclamation line in 1763, which basically follows the continent, the Eastern Continental Divide, right? So anywhere where rivers flow west into the Mississippi, right? No British settlement. And the Crown does that, particularly because it wants to tamp down this fighting, right? It's like, we don't want any more fighting between Virginia and Pennsylvania. We don't want any more fighting between the British and the Indians. We don't want to provoke the French people that are still out there, of which there are a ton because they are intermarried with Indians, right? Like, there are plenty of French people still out there in that part of the world, right? So the Crown's solution to this problem is sort of like, here's a line, don't cross it, right? How well does that work? Not at all, right? It doesn't really work well at all because, of course, it's just a line on a map in London. It's not an actual barrier in the real world. All it does is it prevents those land speculators like the Ohio Company. And the Pennsylvanians in 1764 organized what's called the Indiana Company based on Croghan's claims from the early 1750s, right? All it does is it prevents the Ohio Company and the Indiana Company from inserting themselves into that process of settlement and profiting from it, right? If they can't get legal claim to this land because of the Royal Proclamation, they can't then turn around and sell legal claim to settlers. They're removed from the equation. They're removed from the profit, right? But that doesn't stop the settlers who are just going out there and squatting and laying claim to the land themselves, right? And as a side note, right, this is one of the absolute chief beefs that the Virginia elite has with the Crown in the 1760s and the 1770s is, right, the Crown is interfering with their ability to profit off this process of westward expansion, right? You get a bunch of attempts to sort of end run around this, right? Where you've got one group of British negotiators negotiating with the Cherokee to try to translate Cherokee claims to the Ohio Valley into legal claims. You've got another set of the British negotiators dealing with the Iroquois, trying to translate Iroquois claims into a claim here. You've got two dueling treaties in 1768. There's one called the Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokee, and then the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois, when these are different factions of British land speculators deploying different groups of Indians to try to get their claws on the Ohio Valley. Total mess, right? Ben Franklin rolls in the late 1760s and tries to organize what he calls the Grand Ohio Company, which is trying to merge the claims of both the Ohio Company and the Indiana Company into one giant kind of speculative organization. And he's doing this with a specifically nationalist intent, right? He was like, we want to stop Virginia and Pennsylvania from fighting with each other. Let's all get along. And this is, of course, 1769, as things are heating up more with the relationship with Britain, right? He's like, we need to settle these issues we have between ourselves about Western land speculation so that we can be on the same side against the British, right? So Franklin tries to get into this with what he calls the Grand Ohio Company, which I love that, right? So this remains a mess, and remains a mess through the period of the Articles of Confederation, right, through the 1780s. And it's the imperative of national unity coming out of the Revolution that finally sort of lights enough of a fire under people to kind of get these issues resolved. But then I want to reflect a little bit on Washington and Mercer just in my closing moments here, right? I would describe them as having a sort of an imperial friendship, right? This is a friendship that is deep, like I said, deeply characteristic of this moment, I think, in British imperial history, right? Mercer, well, first of all, I mean, he's from the mother country to begin with, right? But identified with the interests of Pennsylvania, right? Washington, of course, very deeply identified with the material interests of Virginia in the West, right? If they had met in 1748, would they have been friends? I don't know, right? But they meet in this moment, right, where the conditions of war with the French and Indians put them on the same side and have them thinking not as Virginians, not as Pennsylvanians, but as sort of subjects and agents of the great and grandiose British Empire, right? So I would characterize their friendship as a product of this imperial moment, right? I think it also is this is an important founding moment for the American Revolution, right? Sort of half a generation later, right? Because once Virginians and Pennsylvanians begin to think of themselves as British subjects with shared interests, and particularly as North American or colonial British subjects with particular interests, right? That's, I think, what you see embodied in that friendship and in that move of Mercer from Pennsylvania to Virginia, right? You see embodied in that, right, is the formation of this new kind of intercolonial identity that can begin to be activated into a politics of collective resistance to the empire, right? And that's really, I think, the story of the later 1760s and the first half of the 1770s, right, is the colonists overcoming those older provincial competitive ways of understanding themselves, emerging into this moment of understanding themselves as British subjects, even if a very particular asterisk kind of British subject, right? Colonial North American British subjects, right? Which then gives them a framework for cooperation and understanding of shared grievance with the mother country, right? Which lays the kind of political groundwork for what's to come in the middle of the 1770s, right? So I think Mercer and Washington are like sort of a beautiful illustration of that, right? In the story. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Right? Yes? Yeah, okay.
We do, if anyone's interested, we do have Dr. Mercer's medal from Kittanning, I don't know. Anyway, in the other room, if anyone wants to look at it.
Well, that's cool.
So go ahead, sir.
That's okay. Wasn't there a lot else going on with the 7 Years' War between England and France besides just this?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. No, I'm sort of, we're microscopically focused on this one particular theater of the war, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of fighting in Canada, right? And in fact, much of the, I think, most decisive and important fighting is happening in Canada, right? With the siege of Louisbourg in what's now Nova Scotia, right? The Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside of Quebec City, and really the thing that changes the momentum here. Is in right? The thing that allows the momentum to change in the Ohio Valley is that in 1759, the British take control of the St. Lawrence Valley through that series of victories in Canada. And what that does is it isolates the French in the interior from commercial relationships with France itself. And because their relationships with indigenous people are built on this kind of economic cooperation, right, that relies on connection to markets in Europe and France. Once the British are able to effectively sever that connection for the interior French from the mother country, which flows out through Canada, then Indians, they don't change sides so much because they more or less prefer the British to the French. Not universally, but they tend to, right? They don't change sides so much. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. They more or less prefer the French to the British. I'm sorry. Yeah. They don't change sides so much, they just sort of step back from the fighting a little bit in 1759 and 1760. And I think so yeah, you are absolutely right. There's a lot of things going on outside of this particular theater of the war that are affecting what's happening in this theater of the war. There's fighting in Europe, right? There's fighting on the eastern coast of India, right, where both the British and the French are beginning to build kind of trading presences in the subcontinent, right? This is like, you could think of this as the very embryonic version of British Empire in India, right? And in the 18th century, the French are right there with them and competitive with them in that, and this is a moment where the British are kind of taking the upper hand in India. The Spanish joined the war on the side of the French kind of belatedly because they are worried that, they don't like the idea of British hegemony, right? They're seeing the British winning kind of broadly on a global scale, and they don't like the rise they're worried about, so they joined the war on the side of the French kind of at the last minute. And so there's fighting between British and Spanish naval battles out in like the Philippines, right? So this war is happening in Asia at the same time. The British conquer Saint-Domingue, which is the country now known as Haiti, which is, that's a big deal because at this point, Saint-Domingue is the most profitable single colony in the New World. Sugar and coffee, with sugar and coffee being grown, I should say, on the back of an absolutely horrific regime of slavery, right, in Saint-Domingue. It's a brutal, brutal place, but it's the most profitable colony in the New World at that point, and the British actually capture Saint-Domingue, and then they give it back, and that's a whole other story that we could talk about in the 1760s. Mostly because British sugar interests in places like Barbados and Jamaica don't want to compete with French sugar planters from Saint-Domingue, so they get them to give it back, right? And that then becomes this whole other thing. So yeah, no, this is happening. This is, in some ways, I often like to describe the 7 Years' War as the first like truly global war, right? When we're talking about spanning from East Asia to South Asia to the Caribbean to Europe to North America, it's really happening all over the place. And yeah, so I'm laser zoomed in on this like one little kind of area of the war. Yeah.
How old is he in this picture, do you know?
I have no idea.
Okay, and when did he come here? How old was he when he came here?
Born in 1726, he came here in 1760, so he would have been 34. Right? Yeah.
Where did he get his medical training?
At the University of Aberdeen, I believe. Right? He's from Aberdeenshire, which is like way the hell blasted northern Scotland, right? Yeah, like the kind of place where there's like not a lot of trees, I think. Yeah. The kind of place that honestly, I mean, Mercer had a very particular political set of reasons for coming when he did in 1746. But there's a ton of people coming from that sort of what I would describe as the peripheries of the British Isles, of which northern Scotland absolutely counts, right? Who are flowing into particularly the middle colonies. And that is actually one of the big drivers of those population spikes I showed you in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, secondarily in places like North Carolina, right? Those are one of the big drivers of that population spike is people grabbing the opportunity to leave the kind of like I said, the sort of the blasted edges of the British Isles and go someplace with more opportunity. So, you know, Mercer had his own reason for coming, right? But he would have been very characteristic of his generation, right? More educated than most of the people who are doing that, though, right? As someone who had medical training, right? And that's important to say because there's not really any formal medical training. No, I mean, there's definitely no formal medical training in the colonies in the 1740s, right? The first one is the University of Pennsylvania, which I want to say is 1780-ish. Yeah, right. So it's the first like formal medical education in the colonies, and so you know he would have been unusual, and this also would have been quite an opportunity, right? Because there weren't a lot of doctors with formal training, right? So I mean, I think when Washington said, "Come to Fredericksburg, you'll do well there," I mean, he knew what he was talking about, right? Because there are not a lot of people like Mercer floating around in the colonies. Yeah. There are a lot of Scottish people in this part of Virginia, though. Yeah. in these years, yeah, coming in. Other questions? Yeah.
So when he moved from Scotland, he moved to kind of the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, he was outside of, it's actually the town got named Mercersburg later on, right? So you could actually go on Google Maps, it's called Mercersburg, it was not called that. Greencastle is right here, so Chambers Fort is what's now the town of Chambersburg. So Greencastle is kind of just south of it here, and he lived west a little bit.
My question is, if he had all this medical training, so he was in high demand as a doctor.
Yeah.
Why did he move to the middle of nowhere? I don't know why you should know that, but you know.
No, I mean, I think that because there, to the extent that there would have been competitors, right, people with formal medical training, they would have been much more likely to be in the more settled, densely settled parts of Pennsylvania, right? So, I think this was a real, move to the sort of green fields, right? And he would be the only one around, right? And
So did he buy a lot of land here or settle on?
yeah, right. I mean,
in Pennsylvania?
very few people, particularly living in that kind of circumstance, would have made their living from medicine alone, right? Mostly just because there aren't well enough developed markets for things like food, right? If you get paid money to do medical care and then you want to go buy food, right? There's not particularly in backcountry Pennsylvania, there's not a hugely developed market to allow you to do that, right? So even someone who's working as a doctor is probably presiding over a household that is generating much of its own foodstuffs and that kind of thing, right? So I think that also probably helps to explain why he's out there too, right? Because he, like other settlers coming in from the British Isles in the 1740s, are looking for cheap but fertile land, right? Yeah.
And then was he paid to go to be a military officer?
Yeah, they're usually, it's a complicated question because colonial governments never have enough money to pay them, right? So the payment is often in the form of scrip or in the form of what are kind of like provincial governmental IOUs. And actually one of the things that is driving further competition after the war in the Ohio Valley for this land is that both, particularly Pennsylvania, one of the ways they want to settle debts with these soldiers who have served in their provincial forces is instead of giving them money, because they don't have any money to give them land, right? So this is something that happens in the French and Indian War and the Revolution, right? And going forward, which is, the government sort of pays you in IOUs, and then at the end, instead of giving you money, says, well, you can have your pick of the land in this part of the world, right? They often are called military reservations, right? And that is actually another factor that is in the mix in the 1760s in the Ohio Valley, is that Pennsylvania in particular is trying to get veterans settled out there as a way to not only to sort of get a population loyal to Pennsylvania in that part of the world, but as a way to discharge their debts to them, right? Yeah, there's never enough money, right?
One more really
Sure,
quick.
yeah, please, yeah.
You talked about this guy from Pennsylvania, Krogan?
George Krogan, Croghan.
Wait, can you spell it again?
Croghan.
Because he sounds like a fascinating guy.
He is fascinating.
Can you tell us more about him?
Yeah, so there's this whole cohort of, I think for interesting reasons, largely Scots-Irish, sort of like what you might think of as kind of like borderland operators, right? In the middle decades of the 18th century. Krogan is the most famous one is William Johnston up in New York, right? William Johnson, I'm sorry, who marries a very prominent Mohawk and basically sort of is the embodiment of the Anglo-Iroquois alliance at this point, him and his wife, right? And he builds this house in upstate New York, in the Mohawk Valley called Johnson Hall, right? And it's, you should look up pictures of it, right? Because he wants to make like this English baronial manor, but he doesn't have any stonemasons. So he carves chunks of wood to look like stones and stacks them up, right? And it looks like a Georgian mansion, right? And he lives there sort of like with this gigantic sort of extended Anglo-Mohawk family in this sort of like baronial splendor, and is basically both the political and economic and diplomatic sort of,
He's the governor.
yeah, he basically runs things informally, right? And he's the one who negotiates the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, deploying his relationships with the Iroquois in order to assert British claims, and particularly also then like New York claims over the Ohio Valley. And Croghan is sort of one of those guys, right? He does not kind of settle down the way that Johnson does. He doesn't, sort of build himself a manor and live in splendor out in the Ohio Valley. Croghan is much more of a kind of back and forth. He's got fingers in lots of pots, and that has to do also with the internal indigenous politics of the Ohio Valley, right? There's no one overwhelmingly dominant force in this area the way the Iroquois are in New York, right? So he's got relations with the Delaware, he's got relations with the Shawnees, he's got relations with the Mingos, right? So Croghan is much more of a kind of rolling stone. He's back and forth between the Ohio Valley and Philadelphia, but he's a similar sort of figure. And I think there's this whole sort of cohort of these guys. Interesting, a lot of them are Scots-Irish, right? So these are people who had, whose families a generation or two previously had moved from Scotland to Northern Ireland and are now sort of moving on, right? And I think that there's interesting things to be said there about people who have these kinds of, what I might think of as almost entrepreneurial relationships with empire, right? These are families who have, in this case, several generations of history of sort of moving around, taking entrepreneurial advantage of how the British Empire is growing and moving and expanding. And so this is just sort of like the next generation of that, right? And the landscape to do that is the West, the Trans-Appalachian West at this point.
Well, I feel like I have a wonderful afternoon with Wikipedia.
Yes, totally, yeah.
So thank you very
Thank you, yeah. Yeah, and a lot of these guys are, I find them to be very sympathetic, right? Because they are working hard to extend British imperial claims. But on the ground, they very much understand that means building meaningful collaborative relationships with indigenous people. And what you see, particularly in the late 1760s, is that there's a lot of conflict between those guys, right, the Croghans, the Johnsons, and the British imperial authorities, right? When the British win and sign the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and the French are formally out of North America, a lot of the military leaders and policymakers back in London, the way they interpret this as like, well, we won and we get to go in there and like have our empire, right? And and they're drawn lines on maps and that kind of thing. And when you get guys like Croghan and Johnson being like, no, this is more complicated than this, guys, right? It's important. I think a really important moment in that is Pontiac's War, which is in October of 1763 in Detroit, right? Which is where a bunch of sort of arrogant redcoat British Army generals roll in there and begin dictating to the Ottawas and the Wyandots how things are going to go, and they're like, no, and they sort of besiege Detroit for several months, and the whole thing sort of ends up falling apart, right? But I think that's a real wake-up moment for the British to be like, oh, we can't just roll in there and tell Indians what to do, right? And you get some guys like sort of Croghan and Johnson on the sidelines the whole time, writing back to London and being like, yeah, you can't do that, right? Like, you have to work with them, right? Because if you don't, they can make your life untenable. Yeah. So I think they're often kind of sympathetic figures, right? Yeah. I mean, they're definitely imperial agents who are trying to like take land from Indians, but they're a little bit like, no, you got to work with the Indians to do that, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming out on this rainy day. Yeah, thanks for braving the rain.